Someone cuts you off mid-sentence in a meeting. Someone rolls their eyes at what you just said. Someone leaves you out of a conversation on purpose, and they want you to notice. Your chest tightens before you even decide how to feel about it. You call this disrespect. But what is actually happening? A person did something. That is the event. Then, in a fraction of a second, your mind attached a story to it. The story might be, they think I'm unimportant, or they're trying to embarrass me, or I have to respond or I'll look weak. That story is not the event. That story is your judgment about the event. And here is the uncomfortable part. Almost all of the pain you feel comes from the story, not from the action itself. This is not a new idea. It is one of the oldest and most tested ideas in Western philosophy. The Greek philosopher Epictetus opened his handbook on living, the Enchiridion, with a distinction he considered the foundation of a workable life. Some things are within your power, he said, and some things are not. Your body, your reputation, and what other people do or say about you are not within your power. Your judgments, your desires, and your responses are. He argued that people are disturbed not by events themselves, but by their opinions about those events. Read that again. Not by what happens, by what they decide it means. Epictetus did not arrive at this idea casually. He had been enslaved for years before earning his freedom, and he had every reason to build a philosophy that depended on things other people could take from him. So he built one that didn't. If your peace depends on being treated well by others, you have handed your peace to people who were never auditioning for the job of protecting it. Think about what that means for the person who just disrespected you. Their comment, their eye roll, their exclusion, that is data. It tells you something about them, their mood, their insecurities, their manners. It tells you almost nothing that requires a reaction from you, unless you decide it does. So what are you actually protecting when you snap back? Usually, you are protecting an image. Not your actual worth, but a mental picture of how you need to appear to others in order to feel secure. And that picture is fragile precisely because it depends on other people cooperating with it every single day. Marcus Aurelius, a Roman emperor who wrote a private journal now known as Meditations, returned to this problem constantly. He reminded himself that when someone wrongs him, the wrongdoer harms himself far more by becoming the kind of person who wrongs others. Marcus wasn't naive about human behavior. He commanded armies, managed a fractured empire, and dealt daily with flattery, betrayal, and contempt. His answer wasn't to pretend disrespect doesn't happen. His answer was to stop being surprised by it, and to decide in advance what kind of person he would remain regardless of how others behaved. That decision made in advance is the actual Stoic rule. Not don't feel anything. Not let people treat you badly. The rule is simpler and harder. Decide who you are before the disrespect arrives, so the disrespect cannot decide it for you. Here's where modern psychology catches up with something the Stoics were describing 2,000 years earlier. In the 1950s, psychologist Albert Ellis developed what became known as rational emotive behavior therapy, built around what he called the ABC model. A stands for the activating event. B stands for the belief you form about that event. C stands for the emotional consequence. Ellis's core finding, based on decades of clinical work, was that C does not follow directly from A. It follows from B. Change the belief, and the consequence changes with it, even though the event stays exactly the same. That is not motivational language. That is a testable claim about how human emotion actually works, and it has shaped decades of cognitive behavioral therapy since. Your anger at being disrespected is not manufactured by the disrespectful person. It is manufactured by the meaning you assign to what they did, in real time, often in less than a second, without you noticing the assignment happen at all. So try slowing that second down. The next time someone is short with you, dismissive, or outright rude, notice the gap between the event and your reaction. It is small. It might only last a breath. But inside that gap is the only power you actually have in the entire situation. Not the power to control what they said. The power to decide what it means and what you do next. What might you find if you looked closely at that gap? Often, you'll find an assumption you never tested. You assume the interruption meant they think you're beneath them. You assume the exclusion meant you don't belong. But assumptions are not facts, and you are allowed to question them before you act on them. This does not mean tolerating genuine harm, or staying silent when a boundary needs to be stated clearly. Epictetus never taught passivity. He taught precision. There is a difference between reacting instantly out of wounded pride and responding deliberately because a real boundary has been crossed. One comes from impulse. The other comes from judgment. The first one is fast and usually regretted later. The second one is slower, calmer, and rarely needs an apology afterward. Seneca, another Stoic writer and statesman, addressed this directly in his essay on anger, written for his brother. He described anger as a kind of temporary madness, powerful enough to override reason entirely if left unchecked, and he argued that the delay between provocation and response is where all self-control actually lies. He wasn't asking his readers to suppress the initial jolt of feeling. He was asking them to notice it, name it, and choose their next move instead of letting the jolt make the choice for them. Consider what actually happens when you respond to disrespect with instant reactivity. You give the other person enormous influence over your state of mind, your decisions, sometimes your entire day, all from a single comment that took them 3 seconds to make. Is that really a fair exchange? A few careless words from someone else, purchasing hours of your peace. Most people would never agree to that trade if it were spelled out in those terms. Yet it happens constantly, almost automatically, because nobody paused long enough to notice the transaction taking place. Now flip the scenario. Imagine someone disrespects you, and you don't take the bait. Not because you're suppressing anger, and not because you're pretending it didn't happen, but because you've already decided ahead of time that your composure is not for sale. What does that do to the interaction? Often it changes it completely. The disrespect, deprived of the reaction it was hoping to provoke, tends to lose its charge. You stay the same person you were 5 minutes earlier. They, meanwhile, have to sit with whatever it was that made them act that way in the first place. This is not about winning or looking superior. It is about ownership. When you let someone else's rudeness dictate your mood, your words, and your next hour, you have quietly given away authorship of your own life to a stranger, a coworker, or a relative who probably wasn't thinking about you nearly as much as you assumed. So here is the practice, stated plainly. The next time you feel the heat of disrespect rising in your chest, Pause before your mouth catches up with your emotions. Ask yourself what actually happened, separate from the story you just built around it. Ask whether a response is genuinely needed, or whether your pride is simply asking to be soothed. Then choose, deliberately, what kind of person you are going to be in the next 30 seconds. Not because someone is watching, because you already decided the answer a long time ago, and no one else gets a vote in that decision. There's a reason this is harder in practice than it sounds on paper. Disrespect often lands on old wounds, not new ones. If you were mocked as a child, a sarcastic comment from a coworker can feel disproportionately loud. If you grew up needing to earn approval to feel safe, being overlooked in a meeting can feel like a threat to your entire identity, not just an awkward moment. This is worth naming honestly. Stoicism doesn't ask you to ignore that history. It asks you to notice when the past is doing the reacting instead of the present moment. That's where the practical difference between suppression and Stoic discipline becomes clear. Suppression says, don't feel it, push it down, act like it didn't happen. That approach tends to backfire because the emotion doesn't disappear, it just gets stored, and it usually resurfaces later at a worse time, aimed at someone who didn't deserve it. Stoic discipline says something different. Feel it. Notice it. Name it, even privately, in a single sentence. I feel disrespected right now. Then, once it's named, ask whether the story attached to it is actually accurate, and whether acting on it will move you toward the person you're trying to become. Epictetus offers a useful test for this. He suggested imagining that any external event, good or bad, is like a role handed to you in a play. You don't choose every line the other characters say. You only choose how you perform your own part. A rude comment is someone else's line. Your response is yours, and only yours to write. This reframing changes what winning an interaction even means. Most people assume winning means having the sharper comeback, the last word, the visible upper hand. But if your actual goal is a life with less unnecessary suffering, then winning looks different. Winning means walking away from the interaction with your composure intact, your values unchanged, and your energy still available for the people and work that actually matter to you. By that measure, silence is sometimes the strongest response available, not because you have nothing to say, but because you've decided the moment doesn't deserve more of you than it already took. None of this requires becoming passive or agreeable to everything. There's an important distinction worth repeating here, because it gets lost easily. Choosing not to react impulsively is not the same as choosing not to act at all. If a coworker consistently interrupts you in meetings, addressing it directly and calmly, later, when you're not flooded with adrenaline, is entirely consistent with Stoic practice. Epictetus was not describing a doormat. He was describing someone who acts from clarity instead of reactivity, and who can tell the difference between a boundary that needs stating and an ego that needs soothing. Try this the next time it happens. When you feel that first flash of heat, count to 3 before you speak, even if it feels artificial at first. In that short pause, ask yourself one question. Is this response coming from my values or from my wounded pride? If it's pride, wait longer. If it's a genuine boundary that needs to be communicated, say it plainly, without volume, without drama, and without needing the other person to agree with you in order for it to count as said. Over time, this becomes less of an exercise and more of a default setting. The gap between event and reaction stops feeling like something you have to force open. It becomes the space you naturally live in. People will still say careless things. Life will not stop supplying opportunities to practice this. But your relationship to those moments changes permanently once you understand where the disturbance was actually coming from all along. Someone will cut you off mid-sentence again. Someone will roll their eyes or leave you out or say something designed to sting. Your chest may still tighten before you decide how to feel about it. But this time, you'll notice the gap. And in that gap, unlike before, you'll remember exactly who is actually in charge.